You're listening to the Subrogation Support Network, a podcast from Mathieson, Wickert & Layer, America's subrogation law firm, with dissemination of new developments and changes in subrogation law, as well as emerging trends and best practices. Here's your host, Ashton Kirsch.
Hello, everybody. This is Ashton Kirsch, your host with the Subrogation Support Network Podcast. It's been some time since I joined you, obviously with a new baby that came around. We have Madison Taylor Kirsch. She is adorable. I am actually feeling quite rested today. Interestingly enough, the little baby didn't like to sleep for a while, and I was up all through the night, limited sleep, and I feel amazing because the last 2 nights, the baby has been sleeping all through the night. I feel like a new person, awake. Still drinking copious amounts of coffee, but that is just the life of a subrogation attorney. I guess I will digress. Enough about me. Let's make this about you, audience. Let's talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We talked about this a few months ago in Subrogation Negotiations Part 1, 101, where we discussed some of my tips and tricks in negotiating subrogation claims. They can also be applied to anything else in life, be it buying a pair of pants, buying a car, which I just did a few weeks ago. Interestingly, we had to buy a minivan because we are now that size of a family. I guess another personal story. We went and tried out all of the big SUVs because we have 3 kids in car seats now and a 15-year-old. And looked at everything, the big trucks, the largest ones they had, the Yukon XLs, the Escalades, the Chevy Suburbans, everything. And the car seats just didn't fit in it. So we went, last straw was we went to check out minivans and realized, you know what? That's why they exist. So, my wife is now a minivan person. And I drive it too. So I feel pretty cool. It is fully loaded, a Sienna. It's awesome. I surprisingly enjoy driving that car, but now I guess I keep going into my stories. Either way, negotiations. So in the first first podcast, I kind of talked about the background, my background in negotiations, my long commute to work, how I decided that, hey, I'm going to spend my time dedicating it to learning, everything there is to know about negotiations, about the psychology behind negotiations. And I've had this fascinating approach to it. And in doing so, in the first time around, I kind of presented, about 10, I think, of the top 20 tips I have. I think they were probably the most important. So that isn't to say that these are less important, but we hit those. Definitely tune into that podcast if you haven't done so already. But all in all, my goal today is to kind of go into some of those other topics. The other tips, the background on it was, obviously studying negotiations, reading all the books, presenting for the last 7 years on negotiation topics at least 24 times a year. Shadowing clients, consulting for insurance carriers. I've taken a lot away on it, right? And these aren't just my ideas. A lot of the ideas and the tips and tricks that I provide to my clients in these training seminars, they're largely based on, those things that top claims managers, top litigation attorneys, top people in the industry have suggested help them negotiate. So again, this is my advice, but this is not stuff that I just came up with. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about some of those topics, and I'll give some stories throughout it. Interestingly, we're also going to play a few games in this podcast. It could fall totally flat. We're going to do some interesting framing and mentalism tricks to talk about why words matter and so forth. I can tell you when I say fall flat. Another quick story. I decided when I first started at the firm, I grew up in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and Baraboo is where the circus, actually Ringling Brothers Circus, started. So pretty much in Baraboo, you farm or you work for the circus. It's not totally true, but in the end, I always had a fascination as a little kid with magic tricks, and my son, I teach him magic tricks. It's just a fun little thing. So I decided I would do a subrogation magic presentation at a conference. I thought this would be awesome, right? We're going to do some dumb little magic tricks in between the topics we talk about. It's like tips and tricks on, handling subro claims, and little magic tricks, sleight of hand in between. And I started doing it. I'm like, this is amazing. I practiced so much for this presentation too. But then in the end, I go out there before the audience. everyone's on their phones, texting. It falls so flat. I'm doing a trick, and I don't think anybody even saw what I was doing. Like, what the hell is he doing with his hands over there? Um, in the end, that didn't work. So hopefully this doesn't fall flat. But I do have a few kind of interesting examples of how we do this, how we can move forward. So, all right, let's talk about tip one. Be willing to walk away. I think the biggest thing we have here is that in negotiations, a lot of people in the subrogation field, uh, they tend to err on the side of caution in handling claims very similarly, right? A proceduralized basis. In the end, we want to consider every subrogation case, every claim we handle to be unique. And in determining that case, we want to early on in the case determine what our BATNA is. In the negotiations context, and a lot of negotiations professors, psychiatrists, psychologists in the field, they talk about it in that terms. It's BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And it's coming to terms with, when are you willing to walk away? What are your alternatives? So early on in each case, you want to be looking at it, not just, hey, it's subrogation, I get 50%, but more so as, what are the facts? Is this a case that can be litigated, right? Is my best alternative to a negotiated agreement today? Well, we can just go and file suit. The case is worth it. We have the facts. We can take this case to trial, try it, and we're more than likely going to win. Or is this one of these cases? It's too small, right? It's a $10,000 water supply line case. We can't litigate a $10,000 disputed liability water supply line failure with a 15-year-old supply line. We can send some demands. We can shake it up, but it's probably not going to be worth litigation, right? So in that case, we have to approach negotiations differently, right? We have to actively engage with the other side. We have to have those conversations. Make our arguments as strong as possible from the get-go. Alternatively, if we have a $10 million catastrophic fire claim involving a dehumidifier that obviously was defective, well, guess what? We don't have to come to the table early. We don't have to kind of in any way negotiate against ourselves. In that situation, we know full well we have an expert on board. We can push this. We can take this case to trial. We're going to get the top value, be it, there's no real time value there. It's going to be worth getting as much as possible down the road. We also look deeper into the facts. So every case I get, I'm reviewing, investigating early. I'm taking, the time up front to get my investigation done. We're not just throwing out willy-nilly demand letters. We're not just waiting to see what happens depending on how the defendant responds. What we're doing is we're doing our legwork up front. And in doing so, we're able to develop that strategy for the claim that allows us to effectively and properly negotiate. Example being, I deal with a lot of commercial auto subrogation, right? We represent self-insured trucking companies and insurance carriers for the trucking companies. In all honesty, a lot of times these drivers, their job isn't to be excellent communicators, right? They're not trained in the law. They're not trained in communications. So there will be a lot of situations where we speak with our driver, despite the fact we have a solid police report, circumstantial evidence is there, all of the evidence supports our case. We talk to the driver and we realize, oh my goodness, if he's deposed, we're done, right? This case loses significant value upon deposition of that driver. What does that mean? That means, negotiate early before suit. Perfect. Let's try to get it done. Well, we can still file suit. We can still serve written discovery, but we might want to try as much as possible to get this case settled and resolved before that deposition. Similarly, we could have situations where I've had experts, right? We have a podcast episode on retaining experts. And one thing we have is sometimes experts aren't as good as we want them to be. I've had situations where expert comes to us, amazing opinion. It's perfect. He's great. Next thing you know, he waffles and it's a different perspective, right? Oh yeah, I can't say that. I can't say this, despite the fact that was my initial perspective. And I know full well, this guy gets deposed, he's going to kill us, right? The case that the other side now thinks is, we have a pretty hard, pretty slam dunk case on the products claim. If he's deposed, they're going to realize, hey, your case isn't as strong as you're kind of letting it off as. So, and of course, not lying or anything like that, but you never know at the onset. So in the end, I know that case, we really need to get this case resolved before expert disclosures, before the expert's deposed. So in the end, the general idea of this tip is early on in the case, do the digging, build a roadmap. Figure out, can I litigate the case? Is this just going to be a defense cost case? Will the insured be a terrible witness? Is there something here that I don't want the other side to see through discovery? What is it here that's going to specifically make this case settle at the max value? And it's timing based. So a lot of times in negotiations and claims handling, people aren't considering the timing aspect of when to negotiate. So not only do we need to be experts in how to negotiate, but the when also matters. So we want to really set a bottom line, come to terms with what are we happy with? What is our goal here early? And then build around that. That doesn't mean that doesn't change. My bottom line on a case changes all the time, right? We could get, we could do be it a lab exam and we find out, oh yeah, our product's case isn't as strong as it was. We could get some discovery back and realize, oh my goodness, there's a potentially viable waiver of subrogation, right? There's something here that impacts our claim. So all in all, we want to consider these things early to figure out, is there something we should be doing today? Is this a case we need to try to settle pre-suit? If so, what steps can we take to maximize the likelihood of doing so? Or is this a case that we can just get into suit? And frankly, we should get these cases into suit sooner. I think that's one problem in the industry. Too often, be it vendors, subrogation firms, they try to beat on that settlement for too long. I tell all my clients, I want 30 to 60 days to try to negotiate a case before I file if possible. Because oftentimes we settle half the cases or so that we get in the door that could be settled by the carrier. But in the end, waiting 6 months, waiting a year, unless there's some basis for it through, be it investigation or, the parties are actually actively negotiating, there's no reason to wait. So make sure when you're talking to your counsel, when you're talking to your vendors, if you're an insurance carrier, just be certain that you're pushing your attorneys to, get these cases into suit, assuming that you've done a BATNA analysis and the case justifies it. Tip 2. Similarly speaking, on investigation, I like to say that investigation is the basis for negotiations. It all surrounds the facts that we have. In the last podcast on Negotiations 101 Part 1, we talked about knowledge as leverage. And the general idea of that is that the party with the most knowledge, be it the facts of the case, be it the law surrounding it, the jury, the judge, all of the above, the soft aspects, that party's going to have more leverage in negotiating. But to get that knowledge, we need to investigate. I think we've done a podcast. We'll do more podcasts on the importance of investigation. But in the end, the time spent investigating your claim is going to be directly proportionate to the leverage you have and likely to the resolution that you receive. So when we get a case, we want to obtain all documents immediately. Get all those witness statements. Get our experts locked in their positions. We want to get scene diagrams. If it involves a commercial motor vehicle, we want to get the ECM, the GPS data. We want to get all dash cams. We want to send somebody to the scene on a slip and fall to see, are there any video cameras anywhere around? I can't tell you how many times I've had situations where a client sends me a case. Like, yeah, there's no video footage. I take a look on Google Maps and I say, yeah, there's a convenience store right across the street. We might be able to get that footage. Or there's a home right there with a Ring doorbell. You never know. So we're doing that investigation early because evidence deteriorates. It's gone quick. Other parties, while we can argue they have a duty to retain all their dash footage, be it their GPS coordinate data, all of the above, they don't always do it. I have a, frankly, side note, for commercial auto claims, I have a 4-page document I send, including all of the data that needs to be preserved. So just want to be careful. So investigation, get all the documents. Make sure we have the necessary supports to prove your claim before making that demand. Another podcast was bomb throwing demand letters we talked about. And that's the thing. Include some photographs. Get the information. If you need to wait a week, 2 weeks before you send that demand, I'd rather wait because there's the first impression principle, which we'll discuss. It's a psychological tenet. It's the idea that, first impressions matter. People remember what they first get and they judge things. People are very judgmental. You might not admit to being judgmental, but think about it deeper. You're judging me. You're judging everyone. You're judging this podcast. So in the end, it's very important we get everything up front. So we put our best foot forward and we maximize the likelihood for quick resolution. In our demands, include that detailed investigative outline, what we found, what we know. And that's really what it is, because we want to know all the facts, all the good, the bad, the ugly, everything so that we can structure the negotiations and truly set that BATNA. That's why this is the next tip after being willing to walk away in BATNA. It's this, because we can't set our BATNA. We can't come to terms with what our case is worth and what we know unless we know everything. Another tip here is don't trust your predecessor. I'm going to put that in here first. In your company, let's say you're taking over for another adjuster. You assume they did their investigation. Let's say you're taking over for another attorney, be it in your firm or you've taken over the case from another firm. Don't trust that other attorney. Example that reminds me of that is when I first joined our firm, we had an attorney that did a little bit of work comp defense work. We don't really handle much comp defense anymore. We are primarily subro. But at that point in time, I came in, I was a year in, and a client called us up and said, hey, we have a case going to hearing in 2 weeks. Our current attorney with a different firm just retired. It's going to hearing. We need a lawyer to show up and attend. It's a catastrophic major injury. The background facts is this is a woman who is about 25 years old, I believe, severely injured in a work-related accident. Basically, she claims she could never work, a desk job even. She couldn't sit at a chair for more than 10 minutes at a time, so she couldn't work a computer job. Claims she would never be able to work again. So I was given authority to settle at $250,000. Wow, beautiful. It's a big case for somebody, that's a newer attorney. I was really excited. I'm going to take it to hearing, which is kind of like a mini trial in the comp setting. But the client said, hey, try to get it resolved. Well, I could have assumed that this prior attorney, who's really well known in the industry, other firm, good firm, that he did his research, that he did basic investigation into this lady to see where she was before we discussed $250,000. And I could have rightfully probably made that assumption and just proceeded with, preparing for the hearing. But instead, I decided, you know what? I'm going to open up my good friend Google and I'm going to take a look at this person and see what she's like. What's her story? What does she have? Can I just pretty much find anything just readily available, public knowledge on Google? First thing that comes up, the first item on Google when I typed in her name and the state that she was in, Wisconsin, was that she teaches a P90X and insanity workout course. Wow, okay. And she has a YouTube channel, right, where she records. She had about 40 of these videos where she teaches people how to do P90X and insanity. So for those of you that don't know what P90X and insanity are, this was a craze maybe 5-10 years ago, where it's, video based, at workout from home. And, I remember my wife one time, I came home, I lift weights. I was going to go to the gym. And it's like, no, we're doing this P90X thing. Another time she had with insanity. I'm like, oh, sure. Okay, let's do it. And it beat the heck out of me, right? This is hardcore stuff that I guarantee you somebody who can't work at a desk can't teach P90X and insanity courses. So, we had these videos of her legitimately a week before teaching people lifting weights, doing jumps, all this stuff. And we got this just by Googling her. So frankly, I sent it over to the other side and we settled it for $2,500, right? We probably could have paid nothing, but client wanted to get it done right away. I wanted to be able to say that we resolved for 1% of my authority. And in the end, we got, frankly, an amazing result, right? Defense attorneys wait a career to get a result like that. And I got it on my first case and haven't handled one since. I wanted to end on a good note. But in the end, I always use that to remind myself that we can't trust our predecessor, right? This was a great attorney, knew what he was doing, could have probably crushed it at this hearing. But in the end, he didn't Google the person. He didn't look into this. He didn't know. So I always remember, don't trust your predecessor. Dig into every case in detail, even the simple things, because you never know what you're going to find. All right. Tip 3. And the next couple of tips, just as a side note, these are really fascinating things. This is more of like the psychology of negotiation. So how it applies to subrogation, it does apply. It's not so directly applicable, but frankly, I'm just fascinated in the psychology of negotiation. So I'm going to jump into it. Hopefully you find it interesting. First thing I want to just kind of briefly introduce you to is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. It's the idea of setting an anchor. What that means is that your adversary is going to use an anchor point as they start negotiating and adjust accordingly. One way that parties use this in the litigation context or the claims context is plaintiff's attorneys, sometimes you'll see these cases where they have, 10,000 in medical specials, but they're demanding, $1 million, or maybe not 10, they're demanding, $250,000. Like, this is ridiculous. But in the end, psychological principles have shown us, they've done numerous tests to show that high demand, that excessive demand, does set your expectations. It sets the party's expectations. And in the end, over time, statistically, it increases the value that case is going to resolve at. In practice, that means always demand the highest amount that you can reasonably justify, right? We don't want to, demand something we can't justify, but anything we can reasonably justify, that's what we're demanding. Another thing to say is, we use precise numbers to imply purpose. That's unrelated, but relatively related. It's the idea that, when I make a demand, I'm not just saying $700,000, right? I'm saying $675,300.25. Frankly, it's just to make the other side think that it's thought out. So a lot of times when you see those numbers, if you're on the liability side, sometimes it's just out of thin air, but I will try to use precise numbers because precise numbers imply purpose. Case example of why, anchoring works. I had a case, we talked about that 10,000 medical specials, small little work comp lien. I did a JPA for the claimant. I've actually talked to you guys about this case before. We had 10,000 medical specials. Guy was no issues on liability. He was rear-ended. Adverse was a trucking company. I did the JPA, so I had his personal injury case and the work comp lien of that 10,000. In the end, I came up with the demand. There's no way I could prove up highly unlikely I could prove up all of this, but I demanded $175,000. In the end, with 10,000 specials, we were then able to get the case done. For my client wanted about $10,000. We got it done for $75K, right? Which we would have never have been able to do, but for making that. So next thing about anchoring is the idea that, there's been some really interesting psychological reviews on this, right? One group of psychiatrists, and this is what psychologists, interchangeable. A lot of these professors, they do these really interesting and frankly, sometimes worthless, but also very illustrative tests on, randomized subjects and so forth. One of them that they did in the 90s, I believe it was 90s, was they got two groups of random participants, similarly situated. And what they did is they asked them a question that was very, very similar, but also different. They asked them the question of as follows. First group was, at what age do you think Gandhi died? Before or after the age of 140 years old? Okay? And what age? The next group, they said, at what age do you think Gandhi died? Before or after the age of 9 years old? And at what age did he die? All right, so same question. I said them a little bit differently, but in the end, it was basically, did he die at 140, older or younger, or did he die at 9, older or younger? 140, no one lives to 140. That should be irrelevant. And also, that shouldn't impact what numbers people claim, right? What they think as his estimated year of death. But it did, right? And over again, they tested this, and the average age for those primed with 140 years old as the date of death, they answered 67 as the estimated age, right? Those primed with 9, they answered 50, right? So it's not even realistic here, right? Everyone knows he didn't die as a child because his whole story is late in life. You see all the pictures of an older man. Everyone knows he didn't die at 140 because nobody lives to 140. But in the end, it had that huge of a difference, a 17-year difference, solely by the inclusion of a higher number. Okay, I think that's important. How do we use that as well? I think that we just include all possible damages in our claim. Again, this is something more if you are a liability adjuster, and I know there's a lot that aren't just, a lot of people listen to the podcast who are not just subro people. If you're a liability adjuster, make sure you don't get subject to this, right? Keep this in mind. But one thing we can do on the subrogation end is, we include higher valuations, the top valuation on fluid damages, right? Maybe we have a loss of use, a downtime claim. Maybe there's a diminution in value claim out there. If you're self-insured, a lot of times we do self-insured trucking recovery work. We'll include diminution in value. It's a viable damage. We'll include loss of use downtime. Sometimes we'll even include punitive damages, bad faith allegation. Anything that can be included in there to maximize that anchor, set it so that it's highly and much more likely to resolve at a higher amount later. I can tell you, I've had clients play it out where they don't really expect to recover on diminution of value, but those self-insured truck companies, they start claiming it. Next thing you know, they're waiving diminution of value right away because they just weren't claiming it before, but they're getting value for that. They're getting it settled. All right. All right. So for the next tip, let's talk a bit about framing. Framing is it's a similar topic when it comes to like setting the anchor. It's the idea of that the words we use matter, right? It's not just, the words that we say, it's also how we say them. It's kind of a fascinating, this is kind of like voodoo science stuff, realistically. So some of you might think it's crazy, but it's stuff that really fascinates me. And it's things that we should keep in the back of our mind because be it listening to television commercials, listening to really good negotiators, how they negotiate, how they talk. When you're buying a car, you're dealing with a car salesman who, every word does matter a lot of times for these top car salesmen, realtors. So in the end, framing is important. And I'm gonna give you a few kind of interesting examples here to run through as we talk about, like that idea of like be it the mentalism, like the fun aspect to make the podcast a little more entertaining. So first off, I want everyone listening, to think of a lucky dwarf. All right. Now I want you to think of the first number that comes to mind in your head between 1 and 10. First one, don't change it, between 1 and 10. Okay. Most of you probably selected 7. Why is that? Some of you didn't, most of you did. And those who did are like, wow, how did you do that? Well, in the end, it's because we talked about a lucky dwarf, right? Lucky number 7, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. There's other things, right? It's the idea of priming and framing. So we were able to get you to select a number, or many of you, simply by including words beforehand, by priming your mind. Another fun game to think of is, you might have, if you have a pen and paper, grab one to write this down. You could probably do it in your head too, maybe a calculator. But I want everyone to think of a number between 1 and 10. Okay? Now I want you to multiply that number by 9. All right, now take those 2 digits, right? So if you had 11, add those 2 numbers together. So you get 2, right? Put those 2 digits together, and now subtract that number by 5. Okay? Beautiful. You came up with the number. Now, that number, I want you to correlate to the alphabet, right? So if it's A, so 1 is A, B is C, or B is 2, 3 is C, 4 is D, 5 is E, right? In that way. Okay, so now you have your letter that correlates with the number you came up with. Now pick a country, the first country that comes to mind that begins with that letter. All right. Now I want you to think of an animal that starts with the next letter in the alphabet. So if you were B, it would be C. If letter was D, you'd be E. So come up with that animal, and now think of what color it is. Okay. Now you got that in your head. You're picturing that animal from that country. Well, most of you are thinking of a gray elephant from Denmark, right? In the end, that's just a fun little game that I think I learned as a kid, right? So it's just an interesting that like there are ways that you can use words. There's ways that you can structure things to get to the result that you want, to get people thinking the way that you want. And this is both, both conscious and subconscious aspects. But it's why we need to always strategically consider what we say and how we say it. So a lot of these kind of complex psychological tactics, they do add like a small marginal benefit, right? None of this is 100%, right? 100% of listeners did not get either of those answers to those 2 games. However, in combination and across numerous negotiations, by utilizing strategies like this and learning more, it can really have huge impacts just when it comes to just across the board numbers. So in the end, choice of words can really impact how we deal with our adversary. For example, there's been numerous studies where by using words that elicit a certain mental response and, thought, you can impact somebody's willingness to think and operate in that way. Example being that a lot of, professors studied this, and they studied whether or not using words that triggered or brought about open-minded concepts before negotiations could cause the other side, the adversary, to be more open to discussing negotiations, to negotiating. They did studies where it was, they talked about words of expansive, open, There was one where the person that was doing the test, they talked about how their child tried broccoli for the first time. The story was it was broccoli, so he would never have broccoli, just had broccoli for the first time last night. And then at that point went into negotiations. There was a higher compliance rate, a higher willingness for the other side to be open by getting them framed in thinking of openness concepts. Similarly speaking, by just talking about increased value perception, right? Similar to framing, if we talk about, how my daughter has 1 million TikTok followers, right? Or the national debt is $28 trillion. I think that's what it was when I first wrote this. I'm sure it's way higher now. There's the possibility that it'll create a marginal increase in the ability of the other side to conceptualize a higher valuation, right? It's just that it's really fascinating. I mean, again, sounds like voodoo science. It kind of is. But it's also just, it's interesting stuff. Other ways that we frame is by understanding kind of the human mind, we can frame in different ways. So one thing is we frame with, be it the idea of taking advantage of people's loss aversion versus, interest in gain. The average person is more risk adverse and fearful of loss than wanting of gain, right? So we want to frame arguments in a way so that failure to agree, failure to get a deal results in their losing money. Not the benefits. But we talk about what are they losing rather than what they are gaining. It's like when somebody goes to a casino and they lose $100, they feel way worse than going to a casino and making $100. It's just an across the board human dynamic. It's how we've been, how the mind is developed over many, many years. Another way to frame is oftentimes to use menus of options. You'll see this in a lot of contexts where, if you give 3 options and you push towards one of them, right, the one that's more reasonable, you're more likely going to get somebody to select that option. So it's about giving a menu of options, helping them to do so. Hey, one, I was thinking something off the top of my head. One, you refuse to negotiate and you're going to incur 20,000 defense costs, right? 2, you pay 100% of the claim and avoid suit. Or 3, just put forward a reasonable offer, right? We're not talking about the possibility they're doing nothing. There's a very good likelihood that they're going to pick option 3. They're going to make a reasonable offer. That's what we want. Okay, so that's framing. That's risk aversion, framing options. Another one I want to mention is the justification heuristic. This is a really interesting one. I'm still trying to find how it relates to Subro, but bear with me. It's the idea that the simple presence of a justification, that's a because, makes your message more persuasive, right? Credibility is just subconsciously sometimes assumed in these settings. So we want to have a because, right? If you're going to ask, why? Now there's a guy who's written a number of books, Nick Kalenda, who I suggest anybody who's interested in negotiations read some of his books. But he outlines one of these, as we discuss these psychiatric studies. This is one where in an office setting, I don't know if most of us still have printers or copiers in our offices. There was a line and it was a test to see the compliance rate for allowing somebody to skip the line. So they did this many, many, many times. And the idea was at what percentage with what prompts will people in line let you skip? The first group went up and said, hey, may I use the copier to skip the line? 60% of people complied. And they said, yes, you can skip and use the copier. However, by simply including a justification, and what they used was, may I use the copier because I need to make copies? Well, that increased it to 90% compliance. 90% of people said, yeah, jump in front of me. But there was no, what the heck else do you think you use a copier for? It's obviously to make copies. But it created a 30% increase in compliance simply by including a because, right? A why, even though it had absolutely no reasonable justification because it was just assumed. The next one was, may I use the copier because I'm in a rush, right? That increased to 94% compliance. So all in all, that shows us that it's not even what the because is, it's just when there is a because. How do we apply that to claims? I always like to include, when I'm trying to get a case resolved, a because. It's like, why am I asking to get the case settled, right? We should resolve now before we incur hefty legal bills or before we have to engage our experts for this additional lab inspection or lab examination, whatever it could be. So just keep that in mind. I think that is kind of a fascinating topic. I'm currently working on a voodoo science, psychology and negotiations, subconscious aspects presentation which I hope to have ready to present at a conference in the next year or so. So we'll do another one. All right, moving on from that. Next tip. I always ask my clients just to say no to template tactics in claims. A lot of times, we do a lot of workers' compensation subrogation, right? And in that context, a lot of my clients say, yeah, it's work comp subrogation. We take a third, plaintiff's attorney takes a third, claimant gets a third. It's like, hold up. No, absolutely not. Could there be some situations where that makes sense? Yes. Is that best across the board? No. Some states, we should get 100% and our credit. Other states, we should get at least 66.66% and our credit. The facts could differ, right? Maybe it's a slam dunk case where plaintiff's attorney's getting $2 million. Maybe it's a garbage case. Policy limits are 100. We've already paid out 250. Claimant needs to get something, so we deviate. So in the end, I always say, never get and take the lazy way, the lazy way out. Don't use template tactics. Don't split the difference. Meeting in the middle doesn't make sense. Get as much as you can. Make sure that whenever you're negotiating numbers, we don't fall back to the, hey, let's meet in the middle. Let's try to find that compromise solution. Get as much as possible. Negotiate accordingly. Also, I think this is probably common knowledge. People say it all the time. Refrain from making the first offer whenever you can. We don't want to negotiate against ourselves. That said, I'm the one pushing, right? There's a middle ground. I'm the one pushing to get an offer, right? I'm not really an adherent to some attorneys may tell you, oh, we look weak by trying to get the case resolved now. I absolutely don't agree with that. I think that there's no weakness in going to the other side and said, pay me all my money, right? In the end, it's not about making that reduced demand. We're going and asking for the full amount. And sometimes when we go to the other side and say, hey, you don't need to say, here's 100%, but come to me with something reasonable. I'm pushing for that first offer, right? That said, when it comes to making a first offer, sometimes I will negotiate against myself if I've set a BATNA and I realize, hey, this case is not worth litigation. We can't litigate it. Too small to justify it. There's a factual dispute. And the alternative to trying to get a deal is just we're closing the file. Well, in those situations, I'll do all I can to try to push the other side to give me a number. But, if all else fails, I can't get something from them. The choice is closure or not. Then, of course, at that point, we can make a move. We can make an initial reduction to try to get it done because sometimes that will work. Next thing to mention, quick tip, practical tip, levels of authority, right? We always want to consider levels of authority when negotiating. This is a lot of times in the, litigation context where we'll go to a mediation or we'll be negotiating with another side. And we realize, the decision maker isn't even in the room, right? So we need to be very careful, right? We want to make sure whoever we're negotiating with actually has the authority to negotiate with us. It can be assumed, but we just want to be, I see more and more often these days, and frankly, I do it all the time myself, where other sides are coming forward with hypothetical offers, right? They're not saying, hey, here's your offer. And the next thing you know, my client, somebody was this, oh yeah, I think that I could get my client to 20,000 if you can accept it. And then next thing you know, you're responding with a formal offer, right? So we need to be very careful. Was a formal offer made? Was it hypothetical? Who has the authority to do so? If we're going to a mediation, if we're negotiating, we want to make sure, hey, well, guess what? If you need manager approval, I want to talk to the manager. That's who I want to speak with. So it's just a good way, keep in the back of your mind, whenever we are negotiating, ensure that we have the appropriate levels of authority and we know who to negotiate with. Next tip is the idea of setting deadlines. Obviously, claims, subrogation, litigation, it's all just a game of deadlines. It's, the deadline for this, deadline for that, deadline for sending your demand, deadline for sending it to counsel, deadline for filing the lawsuit, for serving discovery, for responding to discovery, for answering the complaint. All of these things are deadlines. And I always take advantage of any deadline we have, right? Anything we can set, I'm using that as an opportunity to, again, initiate negotiation discussions, right? You never know the other side. Maybe they were only at 25, 2 months ago. But now we filed suit, they filed their answer, and discovery is about to be responded to. Great time. Let's go to them and say, hey, before you respond to discovery, my offer's still on the table at the, 44. Are you going to take it? Right? Any time we can use those deadlines of threats of suit, discovery, depositions, we want to do so because it's just the way that we can try to get to yes. So in my presentation, I now have a series of about 15 different like miscellaneous tips. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm reading through and I'm trying to see which ones do I think are most important. Um, you know, grammar and language, that's one thing to mention. We want to include in any email correspondence we send. This is huge. We want to write that email as if it's a formal letter, right? If this is going to an adverse party and you are negotiating, I don't want to see a bunch of emojis, right? I don't want to see, acronyms and LOLs and, misspelled words and failing to, capitalize first letters in a sentence. We want to treat it as if we're sending out a formal letter. Now, if you have an amazing relationship with this adverse adjuster, you guys know each other well, you're joking around, fine. Use the LOLs, use the emojis. But however, I think that, first impression principle is huge in that regard. When I get in an email and I sometimes play, some attorney will reach out to me and they'll be talking about a case and they'll fail to punctuate appropriately, or they'll misspace, mixed number, different font, different formatting, they didn't capitalize I at the beginning of the sentence. I judge, right? Even if it's subconscious, we are judging people and things at all times. Don't let the other side think that you are lesser than you are. And that's something that can very easily be done when we are too lax with email correspondence. So I encourage you, that doesn't mean spend, 30 minutes reading or reviewing each email. There's going to be some mistakes. We work quick. However, read through it once. Make sure that you're not missing anything. Do a spell check, please, because that is actually very important. Another thing to include, offer to draft contracts. That's another big thing more for attorneys, is a lot of times it's just a game of trying to convince the other side to draft the release, draft the contract. Frankly, on my end, I always offer to draft the release, always offer to draft the settlement agreement. Oftentimes, we can get the terms that we want in there because the other side just, one, doesn't want to read it, or two, doesn't feel like negotiating terms that probably won't go anywhere. So I always encourage all my attorneys, all my adjusters, if we have the ability to offer to draft. Another piece of advice of these miscellaneous tips is the idea of unreciprocated requests and non-linear negotiations. Keep in mind when you're negotiating, it doesn't have to be one for one. If I demand 100, they come back at 50, and that doesn't mean that I have to come back at 90 or come back with the next number. Sometimes I'll go back and be like, hey, I'm sorry, like I can't respond to 50. 50 is just far too low. You're going to need to come higher. And it's pretty often they're like, yeah, okay, I don't like that. I don't negotiate against them, but you got it. Like, you have to do something if you want me to be able to respond. And oftentimes they'll come back up. They'll come up again. Sometimes I'll keep doing that, right? Until they just say no. Then I'll make my counter. So just remember, that's the whole proceduralized side. Negotiations don't have to be one for one. They don't have to be procedural. Sometimes you can just make the other side keep increasing. Final miscellaneous tip I use here is the idea that you can negotiate anything, right? I encourage all of my attorneys, right? All the people that work with me, all of our claims specialists and paralegals, all of my clients I speak to practice negotiations every day, right? That doesn't mean at home, right? I don't want to be like ruining marriages out there with you. You don't need to negotiate and go hard on, the restaurant you're going to tonight, or deal with your kids, bedtime. However, when it comes to just day-to-day life, if you go out and buy a pair of pants, right? You're at the store. It's like, hey, got any special deals, right? Do you have a cute baby discount? My wife refuses to take me shopping anymore, which was purposeful on my end. But in the end, that's the idea. The idea is that, like, if we keep practicing every day, it makes us better. Because one big thing about negotiations, if you're training younger associates, younger adjusters, it's the idea that it's really, it's uncomfortable for people at first to ask for money. Once you've done it for a while, it's nothing. But it is. So getting used to that awkwardness of asking for a deal is huge. I have a running record right now where I travel for conferences, a dozen times a year. The last 3 years, I've gotten a free, pretty significant room upgrade every time I've checked in, right? I haven't paid for it. I just get the basic room, but they end up giving me a really nice, sometimes an amazing suite. And why? Because I come up with something creative, right? I'm at this, what was it? This is in Colorado Springs for NASP. And I just, I asked them straight up, I'm like, hey, I saw the guy, the guy saw my Wisconsin Badgers credit card. I said, oh, you're from Wisconsin? Yeah, we started talking about Wisconsin. get into it. I talked to him for about 3 minutes, just talking about Wisconsin. He went to college there. He's in school, grad school now in Colorado Springs or wherever. And then in the end, I'm like, hey, for a fellow, cheesehead, are you willing to give me like a special room, like special deal? He said, you know what? I think I can work that out, and gave me just this killer room. So in the end, something to keep in mind, keep negotiating. One, you're going to get better deals. You're going to save some money. You're going to get some cool things. But also, not just that, you're going to get better at this, right? Because it is a practice and game. We talked about practice and prepare. Obviously, that was more about the individual claims in the last session on this. It's the same thing. When it comes to just soft skills, keep practicing. All right. I think we have time to keep going into a few more. So the next tips are more litigation specific tips. So these are tips that, really just apply to litigation and subrogation claims. First one I have that I always talk about is probably most important, and that's that bomb throwing demand letter. Not going to get deep into it because ultimately we talked about that in a whole podcast episode. I'd refer you back to it. But in the end, it's the idea of, don't just send template letters. Your letter is your first impression. Your demands your first impression. Include photographs, citations, witness statements, I don't like written expert reports, be it expert statements, send to both the defendant, insured, and the insurance carriers. Include deadlines, all those things. Build out a solid demand letter rather than taking the easy way. Next negotiation tip, and this is also an investigation tip, but I think it's really important to talk on. It's the idea of befriending the defendant prior to defense counsel or the other side, getting counsel engaged, right? We can get a lot from building and developing a positive relationship with the defendant. I've had situations where, we got to them, they responded before their insurance carrier. We spoke to them like, yeah, I was at fault. I was wrong. Then we talked to the insurance carrier and they're like, hey, we're denying liability. Your driver was at fault. I was like, hold up. I already talked to your driver. He sent me an email and he sent me an email saying that I was at fault. Do you really want to still deny this? At which point in time, oh, wow, their tune changes and they pay our claim. Sometimes we're able to, if we have an excess claim where, hey, they got $25,000 limits and our claim $75,000, sometimes by just having that wedge in between the defendant and their carrier, we're able to get that carrier to quickly tender limits and get it done, right? I've had many situations where the defendant is on the phone begging their insurance company, pay this claim, pay this claim. I don't want to have to go to court. Beautiful thing to happen. Another great case, I talked about this in another podcast before, but I'll mention it again because I love this story. I had a case a few years ago, California, defendant driver merged onto the highway, texting and driving, rams right into our commercial motor vehicle, causing our truck to jackknife, flip over. It's about $500,000 in damages, including comp, cargo, and auto PD. But that's all we know. Adverse driver, $25K policy limits. Well, I decided I'm just going to call the driver, right? Call him up. Name was John. I think it was maybe Johnny. Call him up. Hey, Johnny, this is Ashton Kirsch. You got my letter. I'm the attorney handling the subrogation claim for, ABC Trucking. Let's talk about this. We obviously see that you have insurance limits at $25,000. Our claim is $500,000. Do you have other coverage? Do you have an umbrella policy? Do you have the ability to make payments beyond that amount? And he says to me, it's like, you know what, Ashton, I really appreciate your calling. I feel terrible. I caused this accident. I've lost sleep for countless nights knowing that I hurt somebody because I was texting and driving and not paying attention. I don't dispute fault. I was at fault. The problem is, Ashton, I'm a 2L law student in law school. I have no money. Could I enter some sort of marginal payment plan? Sure. But what I can do, Ashton, he says to me, is for torts class last year, 1L year, I actually wrote a memo proving in this situation I was in the course and scope of my employment. I was working for my employer at the time. I'm like, wait, hold up. Okay, now we have an employer to go after. Beautiful. So I'm like, thank you so much. Can you send that to me? He said, yeah, I'll send it to you, and I'm happy to help in any way. Amazing. He benefits, one, because if we recover from them, we're not pursuing him for anything in excess, and it's a huge amount in excess. And two, he has this memo. So he sends me the memo. It's actually beautifully written. I've always kind of thought in the back of my mind that I was hoping he was going to reach out to me after law school and try to get a job. He didn't. But in the end, my hope was that we'd get this done with the employer for this individual. So I call the employer up. I send them a demand. Within a week, his employer's carrier reaches out. I send them this memo. Like, what? that's written by the defendant, and they just paid the claim. So we got it settled. So in the end, I think that's huge. Keep in mind, that's not going to happen often. That's, a great war story, but, the ideal. But still, we can get a lot of stuff by making those calls. We can get a lot of information prior to the defense being built. We can obtain admissions. We can get affidavits early on. And we can create that ally for settling. We can look into those other factors, be it course and scope, other things. I've had situations where, be it a realtor or somebody who's kind of one of those jobs where you're often on the clock, but you never really know whether it's work or not work related. It's not listed on the police report. So there's a lot of stuff we are never going to get unless we push for that. So in the end, that is one thing to keep in mind. Another quick piece of advice is considering multiple offers. So defense costs and multiple offers. If there's multiple defendants, this is something to keep in mind quite often, is a lot of times we get one of those cases where, hey, we have an installer, we also have a manufacturer. Beautiful. But maybe we can't point to one of the two at this time, or to get there, it's going to be very, very expensive. Keep in mind that sometimes we can use multiple defendants to get to the point of a reasonable resolution. I had a case just a couple of years ago where, it was a valve failed. We have questions on an installer issue, questions on a manufacturing issue. There was also another company who was involved with the kind of brokering the install. All in all, my ex was $100,000 case. And, our expert was like, yeah, we have to do additional lab exams. We have to really push this forward. On that case, as I do on many others, I approached the party and said, hey, here's the deal. My expert saying that our insured had nothing to do with this. This is obviously a product defect, an installation issue. We don't know just yet. After the lab, after additional testing, we might know. But it looks like there's going to be liability on all of you. How about we just split it 3 ways? You pay 1/3, you pay 1/3, you pay 1/3. Make it right. Oftentimes that doesn't work. Oftentimes it does solicit offers from some parties. We can try to work it out. But in that situation, they just pay. Like, yeah, $33,000. We see exposure here. We're going to save, $6,000, $7,000 on expert costs. Let's do it. So always, always, always get creative. Think about good ways to do it. Try to see if there's any other important ones that I want to discuss. The next one to discuss is first come, first serve states. So one thing to keep in mind, this is just going to be the last thing we're going to discuss, is the idea that in certain states, when policy limits are at issue, right? And this isn't totally negotiations, but it comes into play. We need to consider, I have clients call me all the time saying, hey, we waited 1.5 years to send our auto property demand, and we found out that, XYZ insurance company already tendered their limits to the other parties. What the heck? They can't do that. They have to pay us. No, like in this state, they don't. Connecticut, Kansas, Texas. There's a number of states that follow the first come, first serve rule when it comes to how they pay out claims when limits are at issue. And it says that if it is reasonable, that adverse insurance carrier can pay out whoever makes the first claim. And then the others are just stuck going against the defendant directly or closing their case. The reason this is important when it comes to negotiations is that in those states, when we differentiate, if we know that limits are possibly or probably at issue, which we often can, given the fact that, we have a police report showing numerous parties injured or damaged, then we might want to strongly consider, hey, if we wait and sit around pro rata, hopefully we get, 10,000. Well, guess what? I might say, hey, client, let's try to get whatever we can get now. Maybe we take a little bit less, but we want to resolve this as soon as possible, right? Or at least be that first party to take immediate action, because sometimes we can get all of it. So in the end, take your time, review each state, just remembering it is oftentimes state specific on how we structure those negotiations. Now, that's really what I have for you today. I actually have quite a few more. So I was planning on this being a 2-part series. I think we'll make it a 3. So, probably in the next few weeks, month or 2, we'll get a 3rd session out there as we toss in some other amazing, co-hosts and, guest appearances. But all in all, I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully we didn't touch on too much or too confusing material today. There's some fascinating stuff here. Thank you guys for joining me. This is Ashton Kirsch with the Subrogation Support Network. Thank you.